Sjir, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Spencer.
Is it true that some charities do 100 times more good than others?
I think so, yes. But there's an even more interesting true fact, which is that a person, I think, can do 100 more times good with their money than they currently do. So it's not really even about the charities being better than other charities. It's about whether your money can do more good than you think. That's kind of the surprising fact, I think.
Now, of course, if the average charity or the average donor did no good, did zero good, then you could do infinitely times better, right? By doing any amount of good. So how do we make sense of that claim? You're saying that compared to an average donor, you might be able to do 100 times more good. Is that because we think the average donor doesn't do almost any good, or how do we think about that?
Yes, I wouldn't even say the average donor necessarily. The claim I would specifically make is something along the lines of many, if not most people, can do more than 100 times as much good as they do now if they knew about these other opportunities and by their own values lights, so by their own worldview. So it's really a claim about many people. I think most people who haven't heard about many of these amazing opportunities out there for giving, if they reflect more on their values and if they were aware of all the evidence available, they, by their own lights, would be able to do 100 times more good. Now, like you say, 100 times differs a lot. It depends on your starting point. It depends on your values. It depends on many things. And so there's many ways to describe and define this claim. We can get into those if you want. So I can give specific examples of charities where you can see this difference, or you can look more at the underlying principles of why this is. And I think everything together, all the kind of indirect and direct arguments together, make it for me very plausible this is true.
So let's consider a kind of very standard donor, right? Maybe they're giving away a little bit of money every year. They're giving it to sort of the standard charities that everyone's heard about, maybe the Red Cross or whatever kind of the standard thing is. How do you think about doing much, much better than that? What is your kind of general approach?
Yeah, so there's again two ways to approach it. So one is just comparing what we know about the charities that we do have data on. So one problem that we have is that for many of these really large charities, we actually don't know exactly how much good your dollar does there, because they don't publish this themselves. It's really hard for you as an individual donor to see how much your dollar would add. Even if you knew, which you often don't know what the charity does in total, you don't know whether your extra dollar has a lot of impact there. So we don't often know for the very large charities, but for some we do. So one example we do know this a little bit for, or can at least kind of surmise what it means, is, say, the Make-A-Wish Foundation that you might have heard about before. This is a charity that very laudably helps severely ill children by providing them with a wish, granting them a wish. And we know a bit about what they do because we can kind of at least imagine what it means for this wish to be granted to them and to their family and to their friends and everything around them. And so this is a really positive thing. It's clearly a good thing. And there's even some evidence supporting that the healthcare savings that granting a wish has might be more than the costs of granting the wish. So this is actually a pretty good charity by most lights because they've actually collected some evidence. Now still, if you compare the costs of granting such a wish, which is about $10,000 of philanthropic capital on average for one wish, if you compare that with what you could do with that $10,000 for other children, maybe not children in high-income countries where Make-A-Wish Foundation is active, but children in lower-income countries where there's no Make-A-Wish Foundation, but children still die of malaria, say, or of other preventable diseases, we know we can reliably save, on average, one child per $5,000. So rather than improving the life of one child for $10,000, significantly improving still, we could save the lives of two children suffering from, say, malaria or another preventable disease. And I think that kind of illustrates with one concrete example, and of course, all this depends on your values and various starting points, but why there are such large differences. Now, the other way of approaching your question is not a concrete example, but thinking about the underlying principles that are at work here. And on our website, we write about 5 principles that can help you find these most effective charities that might allow you to do a lot more good. Just give you one principle at work here is the idea of considering where is my money most needed. And in this case, the difference between a child living in a high-income country and a child living in a low-income country is that a high-income country, we already do a lot of the basic things. So we already provide for basic healthcare, and hence people in the US no longer die of malaria. They used to. But now in low-income countries, there's still these preventable diseases, and there's much less resources to prevent these kinds of things from happening. And so just by thinking about where are there already resources or why aren't there already resources? You can do a lot more good by shifting your resources maybe from supporting children in high-income countries to low-income countries. That's one of those principles.
So if we go back to Make-A-Wish Foundation, with that $10,000, they're going to do something that the kid really, really wants. I don't know what it is, meet their favorite basketball player or be Batman for a day or whatever it is, something really heartwarming. And I think a very natural human reaction is to say, well, why would you criticize that? That's such a nice thing to do. And it's, you imagine that kid getting their dream met and, it feels really, really good. And it feels like raining on a parade. It feels really, really bad. And I think you're pointing out, if we try to do this in a symmetrical way and we say, okay, but if we do that, if we give the $10,000 to the Make-A-Wish Foundation to make this kid's dream come true, then essentially we're not helping these two kids that are going to die, literally going to die, that we could prevent their lives being saved on average for $5,000 each. Then you start to see, in fact, that there's much better things we could do with our money, even if they don't necessarily feel as heartwarming.
I actually would even go one step further. I wouldn't necessarily, I hope it was clear that I don't criticize the Make-A-Wish Foundation for the good work they do. I think they're doing good work. And I think it's a great thing to give to for people, just like it's a great thing to help your neighbor and to be a kind person overall. And it's not something I would combat. I would rather, and this is also our general message as Given What We Can, see people give more and give more effectively. And because of the opportunity of saving a child's life for $5,000, maybe when they were already giving to Make-A-Wish Foundation, now also giving $5,000. So I'm not necessarily saying that the money has to move away from Make-A-Wish Foundation. I'm just saying there are these other opportunities that many people don't know about. And if they would know about them, they'd probably give to them, hopefully, as well. And that's really what our core message is about. So it's not about making the good the enemy of the perfect, or perfect the enemy of the good, I think, is the saying. It's really about, we're probably spending, every year, many of us are probably spending $5,000 somewhere, and they can think about whether they'd rather spend them on that versus versus saving a child's life. And it doesn't have to move away from where they're spending it already really well on others. And obviously, that's ultimately a choice really for the person. We're not trying to guilt people into doing this. We're trying to make people aware of these opportunities that are out there that many are not aware of.
Right. So you don't have to feel bad if you're giving the Make-A-Wish Foundation. But I do think that this kind of mentality of trying to do charity effectively can have that effect where it feels like you're saying, well, you're doing something wrong if you're only helping a child get their wish when you're not saving two children's lives. Do you think that that is a marketing issue, or do you think that's a fair critique that this kind of mentality can make people feel guilty about sort of not doing hyper-optimized charity?
I think it's a bit of both. I think there's some just really deep fundamental questions to ask about when is it enough, right? Like when is doing good enough? And I think that's something we just have to deal with and have to find our own answer for and think philosophically about, think with ourselves about. But I think it's also really a marketing issue in that and Given What We Can, we don't advocate for everyone shift away their charitable spending only to what we define as some of the most effective charities. One really useful analogy I've heard of this often is this idea of separating this out into three different pots of spending, three different buckets. And so the first bucket is for spending on yourself. Is everyone spends money on yourself and on the people around you just for yourself to live a really good life. The second bucket is for spending on things you're really passionate about and are close to your heart and you really care about, such as maybe Make-A-Wish Foundation, might be something that particularly appeals to you. And then the third bucket is for spending on these more evidence-based, higher impact, if you will, charities. And what we're advocating for is not necessarily to empty the first or the second bucket, it's just move some money from somewhere to that third bucket, because most people aren't aware of the third bucket even existing. And I think that's a really helpful way for me to think about it, to not have those things necessarily be contrasting, but think for yourself, how much do I want to put in each bucket, and then distribute accordingly.
That approach is really appealing, right? It really comes across as non-confrontational, just saying, hey, why not think about putting some of your money, allocating it towards trying to do the most effective good that you can, and also taking into account your own values based on what you think actually matters. But then it also raises the question of why? Why not push to move the entire charity bucket into the effective bucket?
Yeah, I think it does. And I think it's a fair challenge and one everyone, again, has to deal with for themselves. I can talk to myself about this. I currently don't I do give in the second bucket as well. So, for example, when a friend comes to me and does a charity race, I might contribute to the charity race. And I know my reasons there are partially just, in a sense, you could say selfish or social. They are for me feeling good about that. They are for me wanting to support that friend. They are for me having a personal connection with that cause. I think that's a way that I almost would put into the broader bucket I've reserved, these bucket 1s and 2s, that helps me live up to my personal values. And I also think some part of my life should be dedicated to really doing the most good. I think, I guess the broader point I want to make is there is a really difficult intrinsic challenge here, but for the whole world, kind of zooming out from a global perspective, the biggest improvement really is not in getting people from everyone down from like spending 100% on themselves to maybe spending 20% on themselves and 80% on other things. I think there's so much to be gained from us just starting to even spend in that third bucket at all. And so I'd love to engage on this question. I have my own views about it. And I, myself, try to both live a happy, fulfilled life to what I need, and then everything above that I try to spend on these effective charities. But I think for most people, even being aware of the third bucket might motivate them to, for themselves, figure out how much they want to spend in it. So yeah, I fully take your point. It is a intrinsically thing. The other thing I wanted to say that I said before, and I think is really important again, is why necessarily compare the already well-spent money on Make-A-Wish Foundation with the effective charities. There could also be other things in your life that you think maybe you spend a bit less on going out to dinner. Maybe you spend a bit less on that holiday because you think that money is actually spent better on those other children, if you also still care about Make-A-Wish Foundation. So it's natural that we compare, of course, to other charities, but there's no need necessarily for more money to move away from other charities. It's just more a need for charity generally.
The 3 categories approach that you mentioned, so the self bucket, the what you might call a community bucket, or things that make you feel passionate about or excited about giving wise, which are often things in our community, and then the sort of effectiveness bucket. I think this maps fairly well onto my worldview, which I call valuism, which is this idea that you should try to figure out your intrinsic values, and then once you've done that, you should try to act effectively to create what you value. It's not a moral philosophy, it's just a life philosophy. It's just saying, hey, here's a way of living you might want to consider. And I think the reason it fits well onto that is because for most people, if you map out what you intrinsically value, the things you fundamentally care about, you'll realize that you care about your own happiness and the happiness of your loved ones. And that's like a different kind of or set of values than caring about other things, which you also care about, like you want to reduce suffering in the world, you want to increase happiness in the world. And then you may have other values as well around, maybe making a contribution to your community, or maybe making the world a fairer place or whatever. But the point is that some of those things you fundamentally care about will map onto some of those buckets, and some will map onto others of those buckets. Like in your bucket of, well, yeah, I do really want the world to have less suffering in it. That's a really nice fit for, okay, try to give to the most effective charity at reducing suffering. But the bucket that's like, I really care about human connection, in your intrinsic values maps less well onto that, and that might go better in one of your other buckets. So I just think there's some analog there.
I like that. I think indeed what we're trying to avoid is some kind of bad compromise where you're trying to justify everything at the same time and end up with the worst of both worlds. And so that's why I like that approach, kind of acknowledging that we are not as simple as one value that we're trying to optimize for, but instead, indeed, if this is true for you, acknowledging the fact that you have multiple values and acting accordingly and doing well by all those worlds by really giving the value you're trying to work towards specific attention. And that's really what this third charity bucket is about. It's about kind of isolating out this separate thing of, okay, I also really want to leave the world in a better place. I want to kind of be an impartial, good person by some zoomed out perspective, not the perspective just of myself, of my friends, by some broader way of doing good. I want to do something there. And then you can allocate some of your time, some of your money there. And that's the way I think about it. And for me, that's I think a relatively maybe high percentage, maybe 50, 70, if you include my time, 80% of my time. But it is really helpful to separate it out and not to feel guilty every moment I spend in the other 20, 30% of my time and money. So yeah, I really like that perspective.
You mentioned 5 principles for thinking about how to give effectively, and you gave the first. What's the second principle?
Yeah, so one other is a very simple one, is just even using evidence at all. So giving based ideally on independent evaluations of charities. Obviously, it's already great if a charity has any evidence that's self-generated, but even better if it's independently evaluated by an impact-focused evaluator. And there are now about, I think, a dozen or so impact-focused evaluators out there that publish some of their research, evaluators and grant makers. And so just going by those evaluations will give you a big step up and can be a multiplier on your giving, depending on where you start. I think that's a really important one and maybe the most obvious one, but one that's easily, or yeah, maybe not obvious to many people who have never heard of those before.
Well, it's funny because I think there's the kind of situation where something doesn't have a lot of evidence because it's a novel idea, right? It's a small project. And I think in some cases, it can make a lot of sense to fund things like that as experiments. But then doesn't have a lot of evidence in the sense of this thing's been around forever. The studies don't look very impressive or show that it doesn't do a very good job of achieving its own ends. And it's a very different kind of like, oh, there's not evidence that this is a good intervention.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, unfortunately, often we are not in a position really to distinguish between those as easily without kind of looking into the evidence properly. And we don't have the time or expertise to really look into this. And then ultimately might end up deferring to which charity has the best story or marketing prepared for us. Because that's ultimately what's underlying these differences to a large extent, right? Is this the market, the charitable market, if you will, is not very efficient, because what's ultimately driving us to give is whether a charity is able to persuade us that we should give to them, rather than whether they're actually delivering value to who they're trying to help. And that lack of feedback loops and these kind of wrong incentives included may lead, on average, more money going to charities with better marketing rather than to charities which have the most impact. And we're trying to change that as given what we can by building this kind of, or by promoting this idea of giving according to evidence and independent evaluations, so that there is actually an incentive for these charities to live up to their impact promises, because now they have to show them before they get money. And I'm not making any claim about any individual charity that doesn't have these evaluations, that they're doing bad work, or that people are malintentioned there, or that they're not having any impact at all. It's just that currently incentives in the space are wrong, and we're all a victim of that, basically. And so we're trying to improve that situation.
I think a lot of people are aware that for-profit companies can have strange incentives with regard to improving the world, where sometimes making money is sort of the same as helping the world, right? Let's say you're selling some incredibly helpful medicine, but sometimes making money can be at odds with helping the world. Like maybe you're selling some supplement that doesn't do anything, and you're having to convince people that it does something. And so you're kind of, the more you sell, like the worse the world is, essentially. And, I think a lot of people see that with capitalism. They know companies are not always incentivized to do good. And a good regulatory regime will be one that makes it sort of, you can't make a lot of money by harming people, ideally. But I think people often think about charities as having solved that problem, like they have aligned incentives. And I think that's also wrong, that in fact, as kind of you point out, the incentives of a charity very often have to do with what will persuade donors. And while maybe that's somewhat more aligned with helping the world, in reality, there are a lot of ways to persuade donors that you're doing a good thing and they should give money to you that have nothing to do with helping the world. Like, for example, focusing on one really sick child and talking about their story might be more persuasive than talking about your randomized control trial and the statistics around it.
Exactly. That's the core problem here. I think ultimately we're going back to incentives, to a kind of a system that's wrong. But the nice thing is there is a solution to this, I think. It's not a perfect solution. You still need a lot of checks and balances. You need a peer review between evaluators. You need to set up a system that's actually independent and has the right incentives in place as well. But there's a big step up to relying on these independent evaluations from just going on your gut, basically, and on the marketing that a charity provides, because they have the incentive indeed in order for them to stay alive, and they'll really feel it this way. So I've been on both sides of this. I've fundraised and I've evaluated charities, and I've noticed both pressures very strongly. And if you're an evaluator, you see charities really wanting to persuade you to recommend them whatever the cost, because they really care about what they do and they really believe in it. And when you're a charity and you're in a charitable situation, you also really believe in what you're doing, and you're trying to make the argument as strong as you can. And that's just a very natural position to be in, but doesn't bring out the best out of the system, if you will, like you say. So
I've also noticed a more subtle kind of distortionary influence where a lot of times funders have a certain idea of like what it looks like to help the world. And then charities will apply for grants or apply for funding, but they're going to craft their messaging to appeal to that particular viewpoint of the funder, which often means that if they do get funding, they're not doing necessarily the thing that they think is the totally best thing to do. They're doing the thing that they think is the best thing to do under the constraints of what they think this funder will fund. And they end up with a lot of like earmarked funding that doesn't actually give them the full flexibility that would be ideal for a charity.
That's right. And again, there is the problem of the incentive there. There's no incentive for this charity to be completely transparent and honest, because they think that if they aren't that way before getting the money, they might not get the money. And indeed in a situation that's worse for both the funder and the charity ultimately, likely because the charity doesn't know whether the funder actually has these preferences even, or whether they just have an idea that they want to be challenged on. And even if a funder says, I want to be challenged on this, the charity doesn't know whether to interpret that and whether that's really true, right? So it's a tricky situation. And again, the optimistic message here is that as a donor, hence, you have quite a lot of power, and positive power as well, to let yourself be guided more by independent evaluations and evidence on impact, on the thing you're ultimately caring about, rather than by marketing or indeed your own intuitions about what works.
I also think there's a kind of meta problem, which is that if you think about a world where you have some really good marketers who are really good at fundraising, and then some really good do-gooders that are really good at doing good, it seems almost assuredly, almost by definition, the ones that are really good at marketing are going to grow, right? Because that's how you get money, by like being effective at marketing. And so you could imagine, just sort of a priori, you might think that the charities that get really, really large tend to be the ones that are focused on marketing and are really effective at it. And so there might be a weird selection bias against the sort of the largest charities as ones that are a good idea to put money into. What do you think of that idea?
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a full selection bias against, because I think those things are almost independent. So it could be, you could be independently good or bad at marketing and independently delivering results. That said, the fact that you're getting more money probably means that you need less of it, that you're able to do more of your actual on your plans. Obviously, getting more money might also unlock more opportunities, but maybe on average, in the long term, you might expect diminishing returns to having more money. And so in that sense, I do agree with you. There might be some a negative selection effect there, that the larger charities generally aren't the ones that will do the most good with your extra dollar. And you want to search for those charities that aren't as good in marketing, but do have really good impact evaluations. I'll give you one example of this. Back when I used to work at Founders Pledge, which is one of those impact-focused evaluators, I had to look into the issue of women's empowerment, and in particular, how we could support, in this case, women to get out of extreme poverty. And there was a charity in India called Bandhan, which was implementing this very evidence-based approach, the graduation approach, which came down to really providing this full program, including an asset transfer, including training, and various other things to help someone graduate from poverty, was kind of the framing of it. And this wasn't just a small program. The Nobel Prize for Economics was actually awarded to the authors of the paper that was, in which Bandhan was also included. So it was like a pretty well-known study with some really interesting results that this approach worked. Now, that all sounds great and maybe is a good starting point. But when I looked at the website, at Bandhan's website, I was just immediately like, this can't be a strong organization. It looked like a 90s website, kind of word arty. And at the time, I was a very junior researcher. I went to my manager and I was like, this doesn't look like a very competent organization. So even if they're doing this intervention, maybe it's just not worth looking into them further. And she, at that point, said to me, okay, maybe just have one more look and have a chat with someone who's like independently working closely with them in the area. And I did, and I'm so happy I did, because it turned out, looking further into the specific evidence for that program, they are just delivering their interventions so well, but they don't have a good marketing department, and they're not used to catering to larger donors, to a broader audience than the people who fund them, the foundations in India. And so we ended up with Founders Pledge, I think, moving over $1 million there. Ultimately, our members at that point, Founders Pledge members, gave that money because of the recommendation that we made. And I'm quite confident, if my manager hadn't pushed back on me, I would never recommended them. And if we hadn't recommended them, these people would have never given to it. And so there are really these kind of nuggets of impact out there that just need to be found. And that's why I'm so excited about this whole field of impact evaluation.
It reminds me of the way that people react to style as though it's the thing itself. And I think an interesting example of this is with high-tech companies. Let's say it's started by 4 people who are really, really good engineers. And you ask the question, what do you expect their website to look like? And if they actually build the website themselves, these like 4 engineers have never done design in their life, but they're incredible engineers, probably the website looks like complete shit. You'd probably look at it and be like, this company sucks. what we perceive as high tech is actually what a designer does and goes and like puts in all these stylistic elements that signal that this is high tech, which has nothing to do with like being high tech. It is just about what gives our brain the concept of high tech. You know, Apple is really good at this. Like they're really good at like making it seem high tech, but if you actually look at what they're doing, these are design elements, right? And so I think a similar thing goes on. It's like you think, well, this charity must suck because their website sucks. And it's like, well, it turns out making a beautiful website has nothing to do with making an effective charity at its core, if you're really just talking about making interventions that really work. Now, maybe you can use a meta principle and saying, well, if they're really that competent, maybe they would know that you need good design and maybe they'd figure out how to hire a designer or something.
Yeah, indeed. And some of the maybe very best charities do both, but then those charities might be really good charities, but they might need your money less because they're already able to market well. So the job for impact-focused evaluators is really to correct for this difference, I think, and to make sure that they kind of market independently for these less marketing proof and maybe harder to tell stories, because often some of these very best things are quite boring, right? And so what Bandhan was really good at is just for, I think, about $300, graduate someone out of extreme poverty or have them go through this program. And that was just a lot of hard work and setting up shop and always doing the exact same program over and over again in different districts across India. And that's not a super interesting story to keep telling. I think you could tell it really well if you have a good marketing department zooming in on the lives of these individual women, but that's not what they naturally tended towards. They would just talk about the program they ran and not maybe about the individuals as well. And so it shows the opportunity that there might be stories in there, but also that they often aren't told.
Yeah, and it's complicated telling these stories. If you take something like the Make-A-Wish Foundation, it's almost optimized to tell incredible stories, right? Because it's this child, they wish for this thing, then they're delighted when they get the thing, and you can get all these great photographs and video. With something where you're, let's say, saving lives from malaria, maybe it takes more work. You could tell an incredible story, but it would take more work. But if you were to track the lives of those families and last year their child died of malaria and this year their child didn't die because now they're getting help. You could tell an incredible story, right? If someone puts the time and effort into that.
Yeah, although it's also, again, here there's some kind of bias against it because prevention is often one of the most effective things. So these anti-malarial charities, they are preventing someone from getting malaria. But that's a harder story to tell than someone actually being cured, for example. So
right, because you can't say for sure that their child would have had malaria. So it makes all the storytelling that much more challenging. Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah, another effect, I think, I heard Rachel Glenister, who was at that point, I think, the head of DFID in the UK, once talk about, which I think is a really good point, is that many charities, for this reason, for wanting to tell a story, often implement multiple interventions or do this holistic approach where they feel like, oh, we have to work with our beneficiaries in all kinds of ways to be able to tell their full story and then show to donors, hey, we're working with them in all these ways. Whereas often the more effective thing might just to really focus on one aspect, like delivering bed nets for malaria, which is much more boring than a story about how you provided money and education and a bed net here and there for a charity. And so this ends up in the worst situation where someone is not specializing.
Right. And if we imagine we live in a world where there's a huge distribution, maybe a parallel distribution in how effective things are, then you could imagine that for a given charity, if they have 15 different programs, there may be one program that's like way better than all the other programs on a cost effectiveness basis. Now, maybe that doesn't have room for more funding. And so you can imagine there could still be really good reasons to have multiple programs. But it's just interesting to think about how they might be leaving effectiveness on the table by trying to do too many things.
Yeah, exactly. And for the wrong reasons, maybe because they feel a pressure that donors want this, like we previously discussed.
Yeah, I think there's also a side wrinkle here, which is that marketing sometimes almost guarantees bad use of funding because certain organizations, not all, but certain organizations, the way they do marketing is that, let's say they make $1 from their donors, they could put 90% back into marketing or 80% back into marketing. And there, the calculus gets very, very weird. You're like, well, okay, most of the money I give you is actually just going to market to get other money. And it's like, is that really a good use of my money? I mean, maybe you could make an argument that, well, maybe if they can grow and increase the pie and get people to donate more than they would, maybe that's still good. But it seems like suspect from the point of view of effectiveness.
I think that's right. And that's, I think, what's really important, that for these impact evaluations, you always look at the kind of total money going in, total money going out, and total impact coming out. So you're in a way taking all of this into account. You're taking into account how much spend is on marketing, how much overhead, how much is spent on the program. But most importantly, you're looking at whether the total amount invested generated the outcomes you're looking for and whether it's cost effective in that sense. So this is actually one of the other principles, is looking at cost effectiveness rather than just at evidence or impact. So taking costs into account and looking at whether this way of implementing the intervention is actually the most cost effective way.
It's funny how our brains often just don't put in the denominator, right? It's just like, well, how much good are you doing? And we don't think about, well, per unit effort or cost or whatever it is, and it can massively change things.
Yeah, it does. We're bad with large numbers, and we're also bad indeed in including this idea of costs into our calculations, into our feelings.
I find this with product prioritization, where we're thinking about, well, what feature to work on. Often you kind of driven by like, well, how exciting is this feature? How much do you think this feature will add value to the users? And you kind of, those things are very salient, right? And then the amount of effort it takes maybe is less salient. And then when you force yourself to go through the exercise of like, okay, but how much effort is each of these features going to be? And let's start looking at it on an effort-adjusted basis. It can, in my experience, it can completely change your perspective on which features are worth implementing. Now, I think it can be a bit of a trap because you don't always want to do necessarily the thing that's like the best value per effort. You sometimes need to take big, bold bets. But it really is shocking the degree to which adding in that denominator can change your perspective on things.
I think that's right. And I think there's also an important nuance you mentioned there, which is you can't take this principle too far. And you want to also make the big bets and maybe do the things that have some probability of having a really large effect and maybe take a lot of upfront costs, but might be worth it in the end. So you really want to look at cost effectiveness in this overarching sense of, in the long term with these investments, am I expected to have a large impact through this donation? And various donors take slightly different approaches to this, have different worldviews in this sense, like they might be more risk averse or risk neutral in this respect. But generally, we think that there are some really good opportunities out there also which are more risky. So we're talking here mostly about, so far, the more evidence-based, clear interventions. There are also some really promising other interventions out there that are more risky in the sense of they might not succeed, but they might be worth the big bets.
So we've gone through only two of the principles. What's the next principle?
Yeah, so I think we've gone through impact evaluation, relying on evidence. We've gone through cost effectiveness. Another principle here is thinking about your what's included within your moral circle of concern. Who is included in there? So thinking, am I just looking at humans, for example, living now? Am I just really trying to help sick children currently in the world, like in the example we already looked about? Or should I look beyond this? Are other beings maybe worthy of my concern? And this could be other beings like animals. It could also be future generations of children. And if you do that, you'll find these new potential beneficiaries of doing good, people you could help, animals you could help, that you might be able to help in much larger numbers, because the problems facing these beneficiaries are much larger and often much more leveraged. So, for example, if we're talking about animals, we know of the billions and billions of animals currently being in factory farms, and those are much larger numbers. And if you give those animals any serious concern at all, moral concern, you might want to also include some of these animals in your concern and give to very effective charities working on those. So that's another way, depending on your values here, because it depends on how you view this, you might be able to multiply your impact on reflection.
Right. So some people will say, well, my moral circle of concern is only humans, or maybe even only humans alive today, or maybe even only humans in my country or whatever. And that's going to greatly change sort of what's the most effective action to take charitably, right?
Yeah, it will. It will depend on how much potential there is for you to kind of improve it on it as well. I think most people on reflection, in my experience, won't end up in the most narrow circumstance there, where they think it's really only about people in my country, because they will agree that in some ways, at least, the drawing the boundaries at the country level is probably doesn't make sense. The animal question, the future generations questions are a bit more difficult for and people differ in their views on that. But the point here is not which one is true, but the point is that many people don't actively reflect on it or aren't aware of the fact they could have a really large impact on these other groups. And that's what we're trying to point out.
Do you think that people should strive to increase their moral circle, or do you think of it as it's really going to differ? Upon reflection, it's going to differ for different people, and sort of whatever once you've kind of reflected on it and really thought about it, whatever your moral circle is what it is.
So as given what we can, we think this idea of impartiality and not prioritizing ourselves over others is a really important principle that we uphold as a value as an organization. So we're trying to not be too dependent on what we think is most important, or only consider our own interests or well-being or other preferences. That said, how far that goes exactly, people just differ in their views there. And I have my personal views, which go quite far there. I think we should be, on reflection, I think I end up including quite a lot of beings in my moral circle based on what I've heard about the evidence of their ability to suffer, for example. But that's something I think people need to explore for themselves. So as an organization, as given we can, we don't take a strong position there. We try to support a variety of donors because we think the big message we're trying to bring is not one particular cause or one particular way of giving or one particular philosophical viewpoint. It's really about this unique opportunity that we think many people aren't aware of you could probably improve your impact 100-fold given your values.
And is there a final principle we haven't covered yet?
Yeah, there is the multiplier principle, which actually is maybe my favorite. It's also a bit counterintuitive, although on reflection, I think it becomes less so. There's just a few things you can take into consideration which could really multiply your impact, and a multiplier is a big thing. So I'm talking here about leverage, basically, not the multiplier. These other things can also multiply your impact, but I'm talking about leverages in terms of numbers. Examples here include trying to influence government spending, which is a lot larger than your own spending, trying to leverage larger actors and influence them. So often policy advocacy interventions might be, say in the climate advocacy space, you can spend money reliably on planting trees and maybe do a little bit of good there. But if you're able to move government budgets to a much more effective spending, for example, on innovation in climate, you might be able to do a lot more there. So that's one category of multipliers. Another one is related to my own work, and this is why I actually do this work. It's this really weird thing that if you can just inspire one other person to give as much as you give, you might be able to double your impact. There are some assumptions there, but the underlying idea of inspiring others to do more good, being a multiplier, is just crazy. And I know for a fact that my impact from my own giving is lower than the impact of the people I've so far inspired. Obviously, that's also my job, but even in my personal life, my friends and family, talking to them about my giving, I think I've probably had more impact than through my own giving. And that multiplier is very, in a way, boring and kind of, but it's also really measurable and really clear. Like this is what we do at Given Weekend. We measure our own impact, and we find that on average, our best guess is that we multiply the money that's given to us by 6 before, in terms of how much more money goes to highly effective charities. And that's accounting for a lot of things, like accounting for whether we would have existed or not, whether donors themselves say they would have given without us or not. And that is just crazy if you kind of reflect on it. Like you can 6x your impact. So that's another very important principle if you want to go one step further.
When you think about influencing large actors, right, to get a multiplier, like influencing the government, which could unlock a budget, obviously you have to take into account the difficulty of that unlock. And you could say, well, yeah, it's a huge budget, but also maybe it's that much harder to unlock. And so maybe it's not actually that much more promising. So how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's really fair. And so it doesn't mean that every policy advocacy intervention is going to be better than any kind of individual thing. And so, again, some of the most cost-effective things we are aware of in global health, say, are these quite direct interventions of delivering bed nets to people to prevent malaria. There might be more leverage things there, and those are more speculative. And so we don't know exactly if they're more effective. So, for example, maybe lobbying a government to spend more on vaccine distribution, but then we don't know exactly how likely we are to succeed there. So the way independent evaluators currently evaluate these types of things is by often subjective judgments and going on track record and going on references by experts or looking at similar interventions, trying to get a sense of what the likelihood is of success with these kinds of interventions, and then multiplying that by the impact that could be had here. And accounting for various things, again, about whether it would have happened anyway, by other actors, how many actors are involved, all those kinds of things. And it's a very difficult calculation, not a perfect one, but it can often give you a good sense of the order of magnitude. And if you, out of such a calculation and many other pieces of qualitative evidence, find that, hey, this could actually be 10 times more effective than just doing the thing directly, that might often be a good reason to prioritize that intervention.
So there might be certain kind of low-hanging fruit opportunities where the difficulty of unlocking it versus the amount unlocked just is very favorable. Whereas other cases, there might be some huge amount of leverage that could be unlocked, but it's so difficult to unlock that it's actually not a high priority thing to do or not very effective to try.
I think that's right. And one example to make that really concrete, the lead exposure elimination program is a program that was rated highly by certain in the impact focused evaluators. They are, I think, a really good example of where you see clearly why it was easy here to move the needle. They, for example, persuaded the government in Malawi that already had a policy in place to not have lead in paint, which we just know harms children, to enforce that policy by just showing them how harmful things could be, and that there was still lead in paint and that it wasn't enforced. So it was really just bringing people, in this case, bringing a government that was already wanting to do this, the information they needed to actually act things out. And there are other low-hanging fruits out there where it's just really information. And in effect, what we're doing as Given What We Can is a similar thing. We're trying to give people the information they need to what we think is something, to do what we think is something they already want to do. They just don't know that they can yet. And there's so many things out there, in my experience, that fit that bill.
And with regard to sort of an interpersonal multiplier, right, inspiring others to give more or to give more effectively, what do you see as sort of the key unlocks there that can actually help people do that?
Yeah, so I think in my personal experience, I've been very positively surprised by what's possible here. But to do this well, I think there are really a few tips to take into account. So one is really, people might find this awkward to talk about their giving and to try to bring people in, because it might seem a bit preachy and it might seem like, oh, I'm showing off how good I'm doing. And that's fair. I think a lot of people have that feeling. And it's also not the right way to go about it, of course, to be preachy about this and to show people, hey, this is what I'm doing. Look at me being good. I think the way that's genuine, I think, for many people, and actually the way to invite people in, is to share your own experience and to share what you draw from it and why you're doing it. And ask others what they think about this for themselves, and ask others to whether they have thought about this, and ask what they think of what you're doing. And in my experience, talking to my own friends and family, just asking that question unlocks really interesting conversations and can actually strengthen your relationships rather than reduce them. So I had friends that I thought weren't interested at all in this whole space that I was involved in, friends from primary school that I had a very different relationship with. And then one day I just, for my birthday, I was trying out different ways to talk to my friends about this. And so for my birthday, I asked my friends to give me 30 minutes to talk to them about effective giving, about my work and about the pledge. And many of them did. And so one friend, I remember going for a walk with him and asking him what he thought about this. And he was just actually quite interested and excited, like, yeah, why not? Actually, why would I not? I could miss 10% of my incomes. This is about the 10% pledge that we advocate for as Given We Can. And I think it's probably better spent on these other people. It's not something I care deeply about, like something I'm going to spend a lot of time on, but I'm privileged, I know this. So yeah, maybe I'm open to this. I'll take a trial pledge. I'll try it out and pledge, maybe not the lifetime 10% pledge, but try out giving for a while. And that was just such eye-opening to me that I had never asked him in this case to even consider it, because I thought, oh, I'm probably not interested in it, very different a person. But then having this conversation just opened up this whole new way of connecting for each other, because now I know he's interested in this and we can talk about these for me, quite meaningful parts of my life and have interesting conversations. So it's in a way a win-win there. It can be a win-win. And then again, this person might give more in their life than I might, or might, depending on who it is, right? So my approach, I think, has been beneficial both for me and I think for the world in bringing in more people, has really been not to pitch, not to preach, not to say everyone should do this, but just sharing that you're excited and then inviting people and asking them what they think about it and what's blocking them from doing it themselves if they're interested. And then I often find people are actually much more interested than you'd expect.
One roadblock I've seen happen in these kinds of conversations is that people will kind of make assumptions about the other person's values or assume that the other person's values match their own. So I feel it's helpful to kind of explore, well, what does this person really care about when it comes to helping the world, and not kind of come in assuming that, let's say you care about suffering, that's sort of their goal is to minimize suffering. I
think that's right. And so our 10% pledge, which is again the pledge that Given What We Can promotes, is a pledge to give 10% of your lifetime income to wherever you think it can do the most good, accounts for this. And often people don't even know this. So when I start talking to people about this 10% pledge, they might assume, oh, you have to give to where Given What We Can thinks is the best place, or you have to give in according with what we think, where we think you should give, otherwise you kind of don't count. And that's one of the misunderstandings many people have about this space, is that there is one truth or one effective charity that's being promoted. What's more important than what we're trying to promote is this idea of using these principles to have higher impact according to your own values. And I agree that many people might, when they get excited about their own values, start pitching to friends, hey, you also want to do this. But it's in fact much more effective in the long term, I think, to indeed ask them, what do you care about? And you might end up in a more similar place than you think then, that, rather than by focusing on your own values to start with.
Right. I think explaining why you care about what you care about can also be helpful, because a lot of times people do have a number of different values and they might say, oh, that resonates with me. But I think there's I think trying to convince people to care about a value when they don't is actually kind of a failing proposition.
Yeah, and it's not going to bring you closer together. It's not going to get you to a productive point. If your goal was to spread your values, probably not going to really help. It can be nice if they ask you to lay out why you have your values and to share your inspiration. If they're friends, they're probably interested in you and what your values are, and that can just be a good conversation to have. But you shouldn't start a conversation like this thinking, oh, I'm going to persuade them of my values. What's much more interesting, I found myself as well, in terms of a conversation, is actually finding out what their values are and then trying to help them with all the information there is now for how they can live up to them. And that's a win-win again. You're helping them instead of trying to impose something on them.
Yeah, I think animals are an interesting example here, where I think many more people care a lot about not harming animals than live up to that role of caring about not harming animals. And so that's sort of an interesting one where like people don't necessarily live up to their own values, and they could be, it's like, oh, hey, you actually do care about animal suffering. You don't like that they live in factory farms where they suffer a lot. Like there's actually things to be done to help improve that situation.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that doesn't mean that we have to, again, approaching the conversation shouldn't be done, I think, in a way of like, oh, look at you, you're not living up to your values. I think we're all failing to live up to our values in so many ways. And I think a value of humility for me is a really important one in this. Just exploring whether they have values there. Like I said with my friend as well, I didn't know he was so concerned about this in the first place. So rather than kind of projecting that you think, oh, they probably don't have those values because they're not acting in accordance with it, maybe they're just missing the information to be able to do this, or they've never had the time to properly reflect on it. And so you can help them figure that out rather than imposing yours.
Now, we'll come back to the pledge in a moment, but before we get to that, I want to kind of take a bit of a step back here and say, okay, at the beginning of this conversation, you were saying this bold claim that many people could do 100 times more good according to their own values than they're currently doing. And, we talked about these different principles that can help you. Could you put that together? How does someone think about doing 100 times more good than they're currently doing according to their own values?
Yeah, so the way to put that together really is each of these 5 principles by themselves can give you often like a 10x multiplier. And it, again, depends on exactly where you are and starting from and where you're going. And there's some overlap between them as well. So depending on who you are, you might want to apply some of these principles that you aren't applying yet. And then often you'll end up maybe applying 2 that are non-overlapping, giving you the 100x. So for example, if you start from Make-A-Wish Foundation, maybe you agree that starting to include the principle of looking where it's most needed, where the money is the most needed, and so also including children on the other side of the world might actually immediately give you that 100x, or maybe you think it's only a 10x difference. And then you add another principle, say the multiplier principle. Now you're going to fundraise for the Against Malaria Foundation, which distributes bed nets, and it gives you another 5x or 7x multiplier. And so you can combine these multipliers and they multiply with each other, although there's also some overlap, like I said. So it's these 5 principles show that for many people, there are these big opportunities to still grab, and depending on what your values and your start point are, it might be 10x for you, it might be 100x, it might be 10,000x. That depends. The other way of seeing this, of bringing these things together, is again looking at the examples for particular cause areas. And so I've given one. I'll give you just 2 more to just give you a sense of different cause areas, because it's easy always to talk about global health. In animal welfare, for example, many people give to cats and dog shelters. And to give you a sense of the cost there, which is also something we discussed, costs about $3,000 to care for a cat or a dog for a year in a cat and dog shelter, according to one of these cat and dog shelters themselves. Now, for those $3,000, we know from higher risk interventions, we can help 30,000 chickens live much better lives, reduce their suffering in an incredible amount by lobbying for them to be released from cages for a year. That's a pretty big difference. Depends on how you, again, your values, how you see chickens versus cats and dogs. But that's such a big difference. One dog or cat versus 30,000 chickens, and also in the amount of suffering you're preventing. There's a really big multiplier there. And climate, similarly, there are offsets many people often buy when they maybe take a flight, which might, if you're lucky, give you about $100 per ton in terms of impact, if they're really well justified offsets. But there are high-impact climate interventions, which are more policy-oriented, and Founders Pledge has a few that they've supported. So if you want examples of what types of things you could do here, I would encourage you to look that up. But there are some that seem to have yielded better results than $1 per ton. So again, there, the 100x kind of seems to be rolling out. There are some, again, these are hard to do calculations, particularly for these higher risk interventions, these probabilistic ones. But there really seems to be a trend across cause areas that you can often do a lot more good by implementing these principles.
Looking at these 5 principles, where is it most needed? Use evidence, consider cost effectiveness, consider your moral circle, and consider the multiplier effects. Obviously, that's a lot of principles to think about. Most commonly, which principle or principles do you think people get the most benefit of immediately or most likely to be missing?
I think the most easy win is in just starting to follow the recommendations of impact-focused evaluators, so just going with the impact evaluations. And those often already include some of these other principles, so it's a bit of a cop-out. It's like using most of them directly, because these impact-focused evaluators often apply these other principles themselves. They will often be focused on causes that consider a larger circle of concern. They'll often look at cost-effectiveness. That's why they're impact-focused evaluators to some extent. They'll look at multiplier effects, so look into more speculative interventions. So I think you can get a lot at once by looking at the work of GiveWell or animal charity evaluators or Founders Pledge, which I've mentioned before, in some of these areas. And at Given What We Can, we host recommendations of these evaluators on our website. And we've also looked into the methodology these evaluators used to check whether it's actually in line with these principles of impact-focused evaluation. So we're trying to be kind of collecting all the best information out there on where you could give effectively according to these independent evaluators.
Let's switch now to talking about the 10% pledge. What is the 10% pledge exactly?
Yeah, so the 10% pledge is a personal commitment to give 10% of your lifetime income to wherever you think it can do the most good. That's ultimately all it is. It's that sentence, but there's a lot in there. So let me back it a little.
And you
bit.
fill it out on the website, and you check a box, and you sign your name. Is that how it works?
Yes, you sign it on the website, and you get on the list. You get your account. You get all these kind of extra things. If you report on your donations, you might receive a pledge pin. So there's these bonuses, but the core of it really is this personal commitment that you intend to give 10% of your lifetime income to where you think it can do the most good. And I think it's important to emphasize some words in there. So one is personal commitment, and that's just to do with what we talked about before. We think this pledge is really about you as a person pledging to yourself and to others that you're going to do this. It's not a pledge to give them what we can. And so we are not there to police people. We're there to support people in fulfilling this pledge, making it easy for them to fulfill this pledge, and of course, helping to spread this pledge to a lot more people. So recently we went past the 10,000 mark. So we now have 10,000 people who've taken this pledge, and we want to reach a lot more people with this. But we're really there not for these 10,000 people to look over their shoulders and say, have you actually held up to this pledge? No, we're there to make it easier for them to hold up to this pledge, to fulfill it. By, for example, providing them with the best possible recommendations we can find without asking them to necessarily give to our recommendations only. So that's an important thing to emphasize. The other thing to emphasize, I think, is the lifetime aspect there. That's both kind of one of the things that makes the pledge really flexible, but also one of the things that makes it really stringent. So it is a really big commitment, a serious commitment. And so we don't expect everyone to immediately say, yes, I'm going to take the 10% pledge, because 10% for the rest of your life is a lot of money. Now, this is why we have a trial pledge at Given What We Can, which is where you choose your own percentage and you choose your own duration so that you can start off with a smaller percentage if it feels more comfortable and not immediately commit to your lifetime. The thing that makes a lifetime thing more flexible, though, and that's something many people also aren't aware of, is that it's not a pledge that you have to give 10% every year exactly. It's just that you expect that over your whole life, you'll be able to give 10% to where you do the most good. And there might be moments where you're able to give a bit less. There might be moments where you're able to give a bit more. But ultimately, you expect to be able to do this. And that means that that gives a lot of people a lot more flexibility, and not the idea like, ooh, next year I might have to pay for my kids' tuition and I can't do it, so maybe I shouldn't take this pledge. No, those people are also welcome, and they might give 20% in another year and 0% in 1 year.
And why 10%? Is it because that's the sort of tradition of tithing?
Yeah, that's one reason you could say. So there's various reasons why 10% has been chosen. There's ultimately no fundamental good reason to choose a percentage here, we think. But we think that 10% has a few advantages going with it. And one is indeed that we know that a 10% pledge, tithing, in the Christian tradition, has actually been quite successful in reaching a lot of people. And people have been able to live up to that to some extent. So it's already an existing thing. Another is that it just seems like it's significant, but it's also doable for a lot of people who are listening to this podcast, just a kind of a broader audience of people living in high-income countries currently, although also quite a few people currently in low-income countries taking a pledge. We have a tool on our website called the How Rich Am I calculator, and it enables you to see where you fit in the global income distribution. And most people I know who filled out that calculator have found out that they're in the top few percent of the world, and often are quite surprised by that. And most of these people, again, most I'm saying, because there might be exceptions that are just currently in a situation that they need more money for a health situation or education or anything like that. Most people find that when they have 10% less to use on themselves, and so use in this third bucket that we've discussed, that will actually not reduce their quality of life that much. They'll be able to make do, and they will be able to do a lot of good with that 10%. So we think 10% is a really good amount there, because for 50% that wouldn't be the case. They wouldn't be able to live the same lives. It would be much too high ask. But 10% sets a really nice bar. So there's various reasons. It's also just aesthetically, of course, a norm that can spread quite well, we think. The 10% pledge sounds better than the 13% pledge or the 17%
We've got 10
pledge.
fingers, so there's that, right?
Yeah, it's intuitive. And ultimately, of course, you don't have to pledge 10%. There's people who pledge more that you can on a website, or less. You can also on a website. I've personally now pledged 20%, and I hope to up that over my lifetime. But the 10% is a really good, I think, thing that we can talk about, and that we think most people in this top 10% of the world might be interested in.
For people who live in places where they're going to pay income tax, presumably it ends up being slightly less effectively, right? Like they don't actually end up paying the full 10% because they're going to get some tax deduction on that?
So the pledge, our guidance for how to interpret the pledge is that you're giving 10% of your gross, so pre-tax income.
Pre-tax, yeah.
And if you get charitable deductions, that means that you this will kind of be the equivalent of giving 10% of your net income after tax, because you'll get back the income.
Got it. And suppose that these 10,000 people stick with their pledge. What's the estimate? I mean, I presume that's some massive amount of money given to effective charities if they were to all actually stick with it.
Yeah, so we don't know exactly how much, because we don't know everyone's income data, and people aren't obliged to provide us with that. We have some of that data, but we do know how much people have given to some extent over time, and that's really impressive. So our community so far of pledgers have given over 300 million over the past years, and they give about 50 million, a bit more than 50 million every year. We've also done estimates of, we now have 15 years of data on this, of how much an average pledger gives over their lifetime. And we think that's expected to be about $100,000 per 10% pledger. So that's a really significant amount. So if we take that number, our estimate there, then indeed our current community of 10,000 pledges is expected to give $1 billion to charity, only these people. And we have big ambitions, of course, to reach a lot more people than that.
And why should someone take the pledge, right? Because they could just decide on their own, how much money they want to give away.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so I think it's good to indeed separate the question of why would I give or give effectively from why would I pledge. And we've talked a bit about reasons to give effectively. But why then maybe I just believe I'm going to give 10%, but I'm not going to pledge. I think there's kind of three categories of reasons why people generally pledge that we hear from our pledgers in our community. And some of those are more intuitive than others, I think. So the first is accountability, and holding yourself accountable to yourself and to other people. And you could maybe compare this to someone who wants to run a marathon, but never really gets to putting their running shoes on or something like that. Like once you subscribe for a marathon and you've told your friends about you're going to run this marathon, now you have to get to work. And the pledge can have a similar function as a commitment mechanism in a similar way. Like you're saying you're going to do this and now you actually have to hold up to it because you've told yourself and other people that you're going to do it. Promises just tend to work quite well. And there's even some evidence, which you could talk about, that suggests that the pledge might be even better at this for effective giving than most commitments are. So that's the accountability mechanism part, which is maybe the most obvious one for yourself and others. The second, maybe less obvious one is, and I've experienced this myself, is that it's just a lot of fun. Like your experience of giving is enhanced when you pledge, in my experience. And that's in various ways. So one is just that rather than having to think about, oh, how much am I going to give this year? Oh, I'm going to lose this money. I'm not going to spend it on this. And then trading off, like, shall I give to this charity versus spending extra on my holiday? I just know I've put aside this 20%. And now I'm going to allocate it to where I think it can actually do a lot of good. And so I'm not going to think about what I've lost because I've already put it aside. I'm instead just have this moment every year where I think, how can this money really do a lot of good in this world? And it's going to be exciting, and I'm going to share it with friends who have also taken a pledge, because there's another aspect of it. You know, there's other people who've taken the pledge that you can share your experience with. So there's a communal aspect there. And I host this pledge party with my friends every year, where people who I know have taken a pledge come together to together discuss where they think they can do the most good. So there's this fun experience aspect that people take in various ways in the community. And then the third reason, which maybe I think is even the most important, is one we have already touched upon, which is the ability to inspire others. And there I think the pledge is really a very effective tool. We see this in how the pledge is currently growing. We see that more than 10% of our new pledges we know are attributable to people hearing about the pledge from their friends and family because they've also taken the pledge. And more than 20% comes from people hearing about some of the people they are fans of or following, or people they look up to taking a pledge. So these are people like, say, a Sam Harris or a Rutger Bregman or a Peter Singer or someone like that. And so we know that people taking a pledge and talking about it to others inspires others to do it as well. And the pledge is just a really easy way to start talking about effective giving, because it's much less random than saying, oh yeah, I'm giving money. Now you have this pledge as a thing to talk about. So those are the three reasons, and they all have, there are people in our community do various things in all three buckets.
When you think about the pledge as a commitment device, would you say it's a little bit like, oh, okay, well, if you decide to get a gym membership in advance, that's going to make you more likely to actually go to the gym than if you don't have a gym membership, like just as an example?
Yeah, I think it is like that. And we actually have some evidence. So I'll talk about this. This is an interesting study that was recently done in the Netherlands, actually, at the University of Maastricht by Paul Smeets and Jannik Kretschmer, who looked at whether people give differently when they pledge or not. And so they had a control condition in which people were asked to distribute money over to charities. This was a lab study, so they ran, and they had a treatment group where people were first given the ability to pledge how much they were going to give, and then only asked where they actually wanted to give and how much they wanted to give a week later. The pledge treatment group gave more and gave more effectively. All the extra gained money was to the most effective option. They had two options that were presented, one of which was clearly more effective at achieving the same goal than the other option. This is a very suggestive piece of evidence. It's a small lab study.
But why did that work? Did the pledge involve giving to effective charities?
So the interesting thing they found was that they had a treatment group, I think, both for the pledge, for a general pledge of how much they give, and for an effective giving pledge. And that didn't make that much of a difference. I don't think they found a very significant difference there. It was really a difference between the pledge and the non-pledge. And their explanation for this is actually why I'm bringing up the study, not because by itself I think it proves a strong point. They're currently testing it out in the real world setting, which I think will be a lot more interesting than this lab study of a couple of hundred people. Their hypothesis for the effect, I think, is really interesting, which is two separate things. So one, they hypothesized that by separating the decision of how much to give from where to give might give you more attention to where to give, and hence you might give to more effective charities. So you're not trying to decide both at the same time, and hence you have some more, you think more about where you give, and you really see it as a separate decision. And the second thing they hypothesized is by lowering the barrier, by pledging first and only then donating, you might actually give more, because it's much easier to say, oh, I'm going to give this next week than giving it now. So these two effects, they hypothesize, might explain these really large effect sizes in the study. It's like people giving 40% more, but it's a really small study again. So I don't think we can take too much from it yet. But these effects, I think, are really interesting. And like I said, I've also experienced this myself quite a bit. I don't think I would have given 10, certainly not 20% of my income if it wasn't for the pledge. It's really that I have this very specific commitment I've already made, that I'm now living up to, that I'm doing it. And otherwise, it would have just never happened, because I wouldn't have had the time to do it, have found the time to do it. And now I have to. So yeah, I think this suggests some really interesting things going on there. And again, it's these are the small examples, but where we really see it in action is the data we just discussed on that people actually do give, and give about 100,000 over their lifetimes.
Who is the pledge not appropriate for?
Yeah, great question. So I don't like that question assumes. I think you're right. It doesn't work for everyone, although I think it might work for more people than you'd expect initially. So the pledge, first of all, 10% lifetime income commitment might just be too much for many people in the world. And I've mostly been talking, and it's also our main target group for Given We Can to promote this 10% pledge to, say, the top 10% of the global income distribution. But the fact is, I think most people that listen to this episode, and most people that I know, are in that. And that's, again, we have this How Rich Am I calculator on our website where you can look that up for yourself. You'll be surprised. So,
because it's not top 10% in your own country, it's top 10% in the world. That's what you're talking about. It's a huge difference.
Huge difference indeed. So to belong to the top 10% of the world, in the US, you have to earn about $23,000 post-tax to be in the top 10% of the world. And that's already adjusted for purchasing power parity. And we're not making the case here that everyone in the top 10% should give 10% still. But why I'm bringing this up is that I think there's many people in the world, including some in the top 10%, where it just might be too much to give 10% currently. That's also why we have a trial pledge that allows you to specify a lower percentage. And so there's quite a few people for whom I think the trial pledge might be more appropriate than the 10% pledge. So yeah, the amount might differ. But as we have also already discussed, it's a lifetime pledge. So it might be that currently you're not able to give 10%, but over your life, you do expect to be able to give 10%. And for those people, the 10% pledge might also be appropriate. Another reason you might not want to take a 10% pledge is a more principled reason, or a reason why you think a pledge generally is not the way you want to live up to your values. And I think, Spencer, in the past we've once had this conversation. I'm really curious how you think about this now. I don't think you're a pledger, but you seem to be a supporter of effective giving and giving 10% more generally. So I'm curious why you haven't pledged and what your underlying reasons for that are.
Well, one of my life principles is that as long as I'm able, physically and mentally, to devote a significant amount of my efforts towards trying to improve the world, it's something I care deeply about. But to me, the idea of a pledge is actually quite unappealing, because I think I keep getting wiser over time, and I trust, obviously there's some point where that will fall off and eventually I'll be dead, but I trust my future self more than my present self. And so the idea of pre-committing myself actually is, because of that, actively unappealing.
I think that's one a reason we hear more often, and I think that can be fair. I think I can even be sympathetic to the reason myself, I think. I'll talk to my personal reason why that for me doesn't change things, which is that I think that whatever the changes are that I'm going to be making, they're not going to be against the pledge. I think it's just very unlikely that I'll live in a world in the future where I think I don't want to devote at least 20% of my income to where I think it does the most good. Those principles are so fundamental to my life that it would have to be a complete turn of events. And this is maybe where another thing that people don't know about the pledge comes in. You can actually de-pledge. So there are situations, we think, where people might justifiably de-pledge because something really big has happened. And I think a good comparison here is marriage. Marriage is also a really big commitment and not something you enter into lightly. But many people separate, and for good reasons often. I don't hope we get as many de-pledges as we have divorces currently in the world. But I do think that shows you something. We don't always know what's going to change in our lives. Indeed, our values might change, our view of things. And so I think the option to de-pledge is an important one, and we don't see the pledge as an overarching thing. Maybe another, our founder, Toby Ord, once told me this example, which I think was really hit it home for me, which is if you promise to pick up your children or your neighbor's children from school, but on the way to school you hear your house is on fire, they won't blame you for going back and making sure that things are in order in your house and not picking up their children. That's a promise that you can break because there's a good reason for it. And a similar thing holds for the pledge. It's a super serious commitment, one not taken lightly, but there might be situations in which you can no longer live up to it.
What's the depledging process? I assume you have to cut off one of your fingers or something like that?
Yeah, exactly. There's a whole ritual involved. No, it's there's a form online as well that you can just fill in, and you'll be taken off the website, and that's completely fine. And there might be a good reason for it, and some people use it, and we think that's right. We think this is not going to be a norm. It's not going to spread far if it's going to be this stringent thing that you have to hold up to.
And so are the pledgers all public?
Yes, there's a public list. It is possible to request for your name to be changed into an anonymous name, but we generally really encourage people to be public about this for the third reason I mentioned for pledging, which is your name even being on that list might inspire others to give. And showing that you are giving might just bring a lot of your friends and family along as well, if you do it in a positive way, as we've discussed. So we really encourage people to be public about it, but you don't have to.
What is known about the extent to which people stick to their pledges?
Yeah, it's a great question. That's something obviously we are very interested in ourselves. So we don't know exactly how many people stick to their pledge because we don't know exactly how much people earn. They can submit this to us. We don't make it mandatory because we want to make things easy for people, and it's not important for us exactly to know how many people give. Also because, again, we're not there to police people. We're there to support them in fulfilling their pledge. Now, what we do know is how many people actually record how much they give via our platform, and we know how much those people give. And so we know that in their first year of their pledge, about 60% of people record their donations via us. Also worth noting here, you don't have to if you're a pledger. So you're welcome to just do this for yourself. You don't have to record via us, but we like it, of course, because then we get helpful data to answer questions like this. And we see that drop off over time to about 30% over 5 years and then becoming stable. So that's a relatively low percentage, we think.
30% filling it out, though. You don't actually know what's happening to the remainder.
Exactly. We don't know about the other 70%. And we also don't know if those 30% actually are fulfilling their pledge to the letter in terms of the amount of money, the percentage that is of their total income. But we do know they are giving, and they're giving to certain places. And part of that recording is actually people giving via our website, because you can give to certain charities via our website. And part of that is just people reporting that they've given to some other places.
What's your best guess as to what percent get close to fulfilling their pledge on a yearly basis?
It's something really hard to estimate well. I've actually become more pessimistic about this recently because of our recent impact evaluation. We tried to look into this more, and we found low response rates when we tried to follow up with non-reporters. And then for the ones that did respond, there weren't many cases among them that actually fulfilled their pledge. Maybe not even one case. I'd have to look that up.
So the more regular responders who are filling it out, they're the ones that are much more likely to be giving.
Yes, yeah. And so we don't have an exact estimate of this, but I would think it's likely in the order of a couple of, maybe between 20 and 50% would be my best guess, people fully fulfilling it at any point. But I've really, I maybe the error bar's higher, so maybe it will be more like between 20 and 80%, if I'm honest. Okay. Because we also, I anecdotally know a lot of people who don't record via our platform, but do fulfill it. And that just really tilts me. And it's something we, of course, want to get more data on over the years. What we think is more important, though, in a way, even, because we're not policing people to fulfill the pledge, is this 100,000 number that I mentioned before. So people on average give about 100,000. And this already takes into account all the people that we don't have data for and that we are assuming are not giving, basically. So even then, you end up with this average of 100,000 over a lifetime. And so even if only 20% of people would fully live up to the pledge, this would be a thing worth scaling, I would say, and bringing to a lot more people. That said, these results of our recent impact evaluation have actually prompted us to do more work in this area of checking whether this is true and also inspiring people to actually live up to the pledge, because we think it's only as inspiring as its community. And so we want we want to know whether our community actually lives up to its own values if we go out there to say that we do.
It seems to me that people that are especially good candidates for the pledge are one, people that intend to give away this kind of amount anyway, and so, but can use the pledge to inspire others to increase their multiplier, as you talked about. But also, two, people who feel like the ideal version of themselves would do this, and they need a little bit of help sticking with it as a kind of bit of a commitment device. Would you agree that those are kind of good candidate cases for this?
Yeah, I think that's right. That kind of speaks to the first and the third reason I mentioned. So the people who need an accountability mechanism and the people who really buy into this idea of inspiring others and have that multiplier on their own impact. I think those are really two people that could really benefit from this. And I think, yeah, I think a lot of people fit into that category. And we're in particular, what I'm struck by, and this is what makes my job so much fun, is that in my experience, I've hardly ever not hardly ever, but not very often had a discussion with someone why they should pledge. It's almost always been a discussion about, hey, what is this about? Oh, I thought this, I didn't know about these charities. What do they actually do? Oh, is this pledge really 10%? It seems a bit much because I have this. Do I have to give 10% every year? Oh, no, actually, it's a lifetime pledge. Maybe I can do it then. It's often been mostly me sharing information and taking away misconceptions, and then people taking a trial pledge, say, rather than persuading people, because the ultimate underlying thing of giving some percentage of your money to where it can do a lot of good for others seems quite appealing to people. So it makes me optimistic about these groups being quite large.
Yeah, and I guess the things that you mentioned actually suggest a third type that would be really appealing to, are those that maybe every year they're like, how much should I give? I don't know. And then they spend a lot of time thinking about it, and it's stressful and they can't decide. And this is like, okay, you've already decided. You don't have to worry about it. It kind of makes your life simpler.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I think I know quite a few of those people who just never get to it because it's too complex. They never sit down because they have to then look up the evidence and they have to figure out how much to give and to look at their expenses, and it never happens. Whereas once they've taken the pledge, they just, like I said, they can put it aside and make that choice, and also are then aware of these easy ways of giving, which are out there.
Is there another archetype you would point to besides those three we mentioned that you think is like a really good fit for the pledge?
Yeah, I think there is one more, which also links to the others, but it is people who just really like rituals and routines and things in their lives. This is to the second reason why people take the pledge sometimes, like improving their experience of giving. I think the pledge adds an identity to your life and a community to your life. So,
I'm a giver. I'm one of these people who's committed to this. Yeah, that's really nice.
Yeah, I'm wanting to connect to others as well. So if you are someone who'd like to share that giving and also learn from others and share that experience with others, I think it can be a really good reason to join the pledge community and know when you meet other people who've taken the pledge that they're living up to these same values.
Do you have events for pledgers and things like that where they can feel like a special community?
We used to have a lot more events. We've actually dropped a lot of our self-organized events just by living up to our own principles, seeing that we didn't generate as much value out of those currently. But a lot of our pledges self-organize events, and we have self-organized communities. Like I said, I myself every year with my friends organize an event. And so that's also what we very much encourage people to do is to work with the local communities, and also many of our partner organizations that we work with host events that people can join with the local communities.
Before we wrap up, the other thing that I'm wondering about is, obviously it's not enough to get people to pledge to have an impact. You want to have a causal effect, right? You want to say that either by pledging they gave more than they would have, or they gave to more effective charities than they would have, or maybe they would have given the same money to the same charities, but they inspired others and got others to give more effectively. How do you think about that in your work, kind of demonstrating that causal impact?
Yeah, so it's not something we can measure exactly, but we try to approximate it as best we can. And we currently do that mostly through surveys. So we're asking people to self-report how much they think they would have given if it wasn't for our work, for Giving Weekend's work. And that's partially what informs our impact evaluations every year. And there we find for our pledgers that they themselves attribute about 30%. I think to be exact, 33% currently, the latest estimate, is allocated. They allocate to Giving Weekend's influence. And again, that's quite an imprecise, and there's many also conceptual problems with that question that make it hard to get precise on. But it gives us an idea that we're having a significant influence in the order of magnitude of maybe 10 to 50% of how much money is spent extra. And that's ultimately what informs the estimate of the 6 times multiplier that I shared with you before.
Well, but that's just giving more money, or is that giving more effectively as well?
It's how much more money they've given effectively because of given weekends.
So given effectively. So take it both into account.
Yeah, so we separately account for effectiveness, so multiplied together, you get this. So it's basically the same. So to be precise about this, we asked for them how much more they've given because of us, but then we also separately account for where people give, and we put the quite stringent criteria on there for what we count according to our definitions as definitely high impact, and as many other things that might be high impact we don't know. And so we multiply those two together, and so we end up with a amount that is informed by both.
What would the dream experiment be if you could do any experiment to try to figure out their impact?
I mean, the dream experiment would just be to get this information and various pieces of information in front of as many people as possible and see how they react. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do right now, right? We're trying to go out there and spread the word. It's just really hard, and it's also what my birthday gift example maybe shows. Like, it can be so valuable to have people's attention, proper attention, and then suddenly someone might be right open to this. But so many things are vying for our attention today. Of course, many for-profits are, many non-profits are, many non-profits are with their marketing. And so having a moment to really sit down with someone and having this conversation and doing that with lots of people, finding a way to do something equivalent would be a dream experiment for me. And it's something we're trying to recreate, for example, by enabling all our members in our community, all our pledges to talk to their peers better about effective giving.
Because it sounds like for some people, it just resonates immediately. Once they kind of hear about it, they're like, oh, that makes sense. They may have follow-up questions, but there's some significant percentage of people that kind of once they get the idea, they're going to immediately find it appealing.
Yeah, I think the idea of giving 10% to where it can be used a lot better is generally very appealing in my experience to people. Like, that's a good thing to exist. I have hardly ever heard someone say like, oh, no, you shouldn't do that. It's really a bad idea to give 10%. It gets really interesting in the details. And for people to be able to ask those questions about like, oh, what if I can't give 10% next year? Oh, what if I want to give to this charity? Is that really effective? That's often where people find blockers. And so having that in-depth conversation with people is often what does the magic, I think, and gets people to ultimately commit. And that's the world we ultimately want to get to, I think.
So we've touched on a lot of different topics today. What would you like to leave the listener with? What do you want them to keep thinking about after this conversation?
I think there's so much to learn, and that is just this really meaningful, crazy fact about the world that we can do so much good with our money, and actually at very little effort. But it takes a little bit of effort to take the first step there. And so I'd really encourage people, if they are at all interested in having a lot of impact with their money, to start trying this out. So to set the first step. That's the thing I most want to leave people with. So have a look at, say, the trial pledge, which starts at like 1% of your income for 6 months, and see what it is like to pledge. Consider that. Or if you're not interested in that, think about why that is and reflect on that. I think even just asking that question to yourself can be really helpful and may help you figure out what else you want to do instead. That's the question I want to leave listeners with, like what they think about this idea of giving, and then whether they are ready to take the first small step.
Sure. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Spencer.